Cahirlic, I'm delighted to be one of those proposing this motion today and very much welcome the opportunity to talk on the housing and homelessness crisis, which is growing in Ireland. The motion recognises that we're dealing with a crisis and it provides real solutions. And I have to say I was disappointed when I read the government's amendment, because it wasn't really an amendment. It wasn't trying to amend, I think, a very sensible proposal. It started by deleting the entire proposal from the technical group. It was very disappointing to see. In particular, I noticed that the government's amendment or counter-proposal didn't recognise the scale of the problem. If one read the government's motion, one might see a lot of activity, but would have no indication that we are dealing with an escalating crisis, that this is not business as usual. The report, Cahirlic, calls for a report from the private residential tenancy boards to look at the difficulties faced by tenants. And I would suggest that in year 4 of this government, calling on reports to begin looking at these things really is very disappointing. And most worryingly, Cahirlic, the government motion says that the most appropriate way to deal with the crisis is, quote, to continue the various programmes and fiscal incentives currently in place. So what the government is saying is, our response to an escalating and real crisis all over the country is to continue with the existing programmes. Now that's bonkers. That is absolute madness, and it's very, very disappointing to see. I'd like to broaden the conversation. There's been a lot of worthwhile conversation around various people at risk. I'd like to discuss 4 groups of people: those with distressed mortgages, the negative equity generation, renters and those trying to rent, and the homelessness and those at risk of homelessness. First, to distressed mortgages, where I and many other deputies spend a lot of their time. Now, it's clear that at this point the government has failed to deal with this crisis. I've been dealing with it every day for the last 3 years, and I can say categorically that the government has failed to deal with the crisis. And we know, because if you compare the amount of distressed mortgages in Ireland compared to any other country on earth, any other country, including Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, all the countries that dealt with the same things we dealt with, we are several times higher than they are. So Ireland is completely on its own in its failure to deal with this. Now, we had the banks in recently to the Finance Committee to tell us how they were getting on, and it was really quite shocking. What did we find? We found extraordinary inconsistency between how the banks are treating people. You're in a bad situation. If you're with one bank, you might get out of it okay. If you're with another bank, you haven't a hope. And we had the governor of the central bank yesterday say he was okay with that. He was pretty much okay with that because it allows the banks the freedom that they need. Very disappointing. Of the 57,000 offers made to date of so-called sustainable restructures, 52,000 of the 57,000 at least don't include any financial concession. In fact, the vast majority of so-called sustainable restructures are one of 2 things. They're a letter threatening to repossess the house, or they are an offer to restructure the mortgage in such a way that the family end up paying the bank more over the lifetime of the mortgage than had it not been restructured. We know that the banks have told us that they expect thousands of evictions. I counted up about 7,500. That's just from the 4 banks that we saw. And that's their current estimate, about 7,500 evictions on the way. And we know that the banks are vetoing the insolvency process in a way that is explicitly contrary to the government's intention when it brought this in. And on top of this, we have what I can only describe as the disgraceful handling by this government of those Irish people, those thousands and thousands of men, women and children in houses who had mortgages with Irish Nationwide. I think it's a really dark stain on this government, the way that was held with, the way that's been dealt with so far. The negative equity generation, Cahirlic, this government said it would help. Now instead, what's it done? It's charging them property tax on properties that are in negative equity. They're being taxed on their debts. Quite an extraordinary thing to do, and being told it's a wealth tax, or it's a proxy for a wealth tax. Accidental landlords, first of all, they had to deal with double taxation. And then in the last budget, Minister Joan Burton brought in a new idea, which was to tax them PRSI on the rental income, absolutely destroying them. What about renters and those trying to rent? Well, there's 2 problems. First of all, in many parts of the country, including Wicklow, there's nowhere to rent. And secondly, if you're lucky enough to find somewhere that you can rent, you have no rights. I live in a rented house. I got 2 young kids in a rented house. I got another kid on the way, please God, going into a rented house. And every year I can get a phone call saying, sorry, you got to go, your kids, your neighbours, your friends. Not my problem. You got to go. You got to find somewhere else. You got a longer commute to school. Not my problem. It's not okay. It's not okay that renters are treated like that. How in the name of God is anyone meant to raise their family and their children when they can get a phone call saying, you have to leave. You have to leave the estate. You have to leave your neighbours. Your children have to leave their friends. And that can happen to you every year. It is outrageous that that is being allowed to happen. What about those who are homeless or at risk of homelessness? Annette Kennedy, who's chairperson of the Bray Homeless Forum, told me that in Bray, emergency accommodation was created for 16 people at the end of last year, which is welcome. She said, these places are already full and they have a waiting list. If we can't move these people on, then we're in a minefield. That's because we're seeing more and more people pushed from rental accommodation. Rent allowance doesn't cover rents, and they have no rights as renters. I don't know why the government can't negotiate with landlords. That's from the chairperson of the Bray Homelessness Forum. In May 2013, the Bray Homelessness Forum found there were 58 homeless people in Bray. 16 of those were children. Gahirlock. They held an event last month where they highlighted the drop in social housing and private accommodation at a time when demand was increasing for housing, rent supplement is falling short of real rents, and landlords aren't willing to accept tenants on rent supplement.
Thank you, Deputy.
Outrageous. Kirlick, I finish by saying I have lots and lots and lots of potential solutions. Some I have already written to the Minister for example, in mortgage to rent. There are lots and lots of solutions. Some of those solutions cost money, and money needs to be found. Many of the solutions don't cost money. And all of those solutions should be implemented by the end of this year by this government. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy.